Welcome to episode 4 of The Secular State, in which we explore the roots of the core ideas behind each of the 3 major types of secular government as seen in the 20th century. So, I wanted to say real quick, just to kind of clarify what we're doing, because today we're looking at Marxism. Last week was fascism. The week before that was the liberal democracy. And I wanted to clarify that we're not exploring the ways in which these various nation-state ideologies manifested historically in the 20th century exactly. That's not the main focus. I assume you are generally aware of the events of the world wars in the 20th century, and you don't need me to tell you what happened. You know what happened. What we are doing is looking at the core premises, the unstated assumptions about human nature and about reality that form the basis for these types of ways of running society. Because if you're going to run society, it needs to be based on a vision of what, let's say, the good is, if there is such a thing, what human nature is, if there is such a thing, and so on. And so some things, there was a lot of interaction last week, and somebody asked, so what ideal form of government am I advocating for if I denounce all of these 3, if I say liberalism, fascism, and today we're going to see Marxism, are not based on premises that are compatible with Christianity, which is what I've been saying so far, then what is the ideal or quote-unquote Christian form of government? We're going to talk about that next week. Next week I will answer this question. But we'll get into that later. So, what about Marxism? So we looked at liberalism. We found that its premises were not very compatible with Christianity. We looked at fascism. We found that its premises were not compatible with Christianity. Obviously, the conclusions of these things, not compatible either. We'll get into more exactly what's wrong with liberalism, I think, in next week. And I'm going to review all 3 of these and show, kind of give a little summary. So what are we talking about with Marxism, though? And this one I save for last because I think it's a little bit more complex in a certain sense, because there's all these positions that people have about Marxism today. People will say, oh, it was horrible. Just look at the Soviet Union and Maoist China and all these things, Cambodia, Pol Pot, horrible. And all the bloodshed and oppressiveness and murders, etc. It's like, yes, that's true. That's true. But then other people will say, well, that's not real communism, or what that's actually a type of fascism, or that, what we really need is this kind of socialism or this form of communism, or yada, yada, yada. And there are just a bajillion types of things that you could call Marxist. You could even call Hitler's version of quote-unquote fascism, because fascism is really kind of more of it's not really the self-identification of the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party identified as the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. Fascism was this thing that Mussolini was kind of making famous. So you could even describe Nazism as a certain type of socialism. And so what we're talking about is all these versions of what? Things that came out of the writing of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So what I thought we would do today to kind of get to the bottom of this, well, that's not real communism. This is real communism. Real communism hasn't been tried yet, blah, 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 blah. What's the root? That's what I want to ask. That's what we always ask on this series. What is the root philosophical assumptions going on that inform all of these different manifestations of Marx's ideas into Sovietism, Bolshevism, communism, is European socialism, like where is all of this coming from? So, and that'll help us answer the question, is Christianity compatible with Marxism? Because something that I always see is some people are like, Christianity is completely incompatible with Marxism, and other people say, no, it's about compassion for the poor, and then they cite all of these things, well, that Jesus teaches us, that's the poor are blessed, etc. And it's hard for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, all this stuff. And so are they compatible? Well, let's ask that about the worldview assumptions at the very bottom. Now, to do that, however, we can't start with Marx. Psych, we're not starting with Marx. Although I spoiled this last time. We are going to start with Hegel. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. That is who we have to start with, because he has the sort of basic philosophical formation that's going to be, I think, critically formative for Marx and for Marxism. So let me start by saying this. I don't think that Marxism is first and foremost an economic system. A lot of people talk about it like this, like it's some sort of an arrangement of society and laws and labor and capital and all this stuff that's better or more efficient than other forms. Primarily, I don't think that's what's going on with Marx. What's going on with Marx is a theory of history and a view of reality. And you're going to see what I mean in a second. Where does he get his view of history? Well, he gets it from Hegel, but he modifies it. So let's talk about good old Georg here. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. You know, all these Germans had two middle names back in the day. His dates are 1770 to 1831, and he was one of the most influential philosophers of modernity, probably, and of his era, certainly. And there's a lot you can say about Hegel, but a main thing is that he had a philosophy of history. So that means that he viewed history, and philosophies of history were something that a lot of people were talking about. What's the meaning of history? Is there a beginning and middle and end to history? Is history cyclical? Is history have these sort of inevitable developments? And why? All these things. So Hegel had a very famous philosophy of history, and he said that history has meaning. That's what you get when you get a philosophy of history. In other words, it's not just a blind, like the universe is not just a collection of objects blindly obeying laws, and there's no inherent meaning to how it unfolds. If you have a philosophy of history, you have an answer to the question of the meaning of the events that happen in sequence through time. So Hegel is what we would call an idealist. Now, I'm going to, Hegel scholars, forgive me, I'm going to glaze over a lot of this because it's not really germane to what we're talking about. I just want to give you a general sense of this. Hegel was what we call an idealist, and this means different things. There's giant articles about what this actually means. Let's just contrast it for today with materialism. So it means that, and materialism is the idea that only matter exists, what I just said, that the universe is a collection of objects, that those objects just kind of blindly follow laws. There's no inherent meaning to anything, only the material exists. Idealism says no, the highest form of reality is some kind of mind or some kind of spirit, and that things are manifestations of this mind or mind spirit. In other words, immaterial things in some fashion are the most important elements in reality, whether you think that everything exists in the mind of God or whether you think everything is sort of a manifestation of a Platonic form. There's lots of ways you could interpret this. So Hegel had this theory. He was an idealist, a German idealist, and he believed in this thing called the Geist. Now, Geist is a German word. You could translate it as spirit, as in like a ghost, Geist, ghost. You see where this comes from? Or you could translate it as mind. So it's also sort of an intellect. It can think. And Hegel talked about the Geist in terms of a sort of a movement through history. Like there's a spirit to history, that where history has this kind of unfolding progression to it. Now, it's not clear what he means. People have formed whole parties interpreting Hegel in different ways. Did he mean that the Geist was sort of the spirit of the age in a general sense? Did he mean it was actually literally the Holy Spirit, the third member of the Trinity, directing the course of history? Maybe. It's kind of ambiguous, and answering that question is not really why we're here. But the point is that he believed in a higher metaphysical, spiritual reality as the most primary thing, and that it was this metaphysical, spiritual reality that sort of directed history, and that history unfolded according to these metaphysical, spiritual principles or motions or movements in the world. And for Hegel, he thought that history is this sort of progression of freedom. So if you look at all of human history, he thought that you could view history in terms of a progression of less freedom to more freedom for humanity. He says, quote, "The history of the world is none other than the progression of the consciousness of freedom." This is his definition of history. And so, he had this whole historiography. That's what we call this idea. So, and he said, in the Oriental world, he means the Indian, Chinese, and Persian worlds, only the tyrant ruled over these societies. Only the tyrant is free. And so one person had freedom and nobody else had freedom. And then in the Greek world, a few people were free because now you had this kind of aristocracy. The democracy of Athens was basically an aristocracy where a few people were citizens and they got to vote. So it went from one person is free to a few people are free. And then the Roman world expanded this idea, and so more people had rights. And then Christianity massively expanded this idea because everyone's in the image of God. Hegel acknowledged this. We've talked a lot about this. But he thought that, well, this idea of everyone being equal in Christ got corrupted by medieval Catholicism through materialistic rituals and money, and that ruins the spiritual element. And so Hegel thought that the Protestant Reformation, the Germanic world, this is what he refers to it as, freed religion and made it accessible to everyone. So this progression from the Oriental world to the Greek world to the Roman world to the medieval world to the Germanic world, he saw it in terms of a progression from fewer people in society being free to more people in society being free. And so he said, obviously history has a natural progression to it. Now, why are we talking about all this? Because of this idea of idealism, that there are non-material forces in the universe, in history specifically, that are working themselves out over the course of history. There's sort of an inevitable progression of less free to more free. And what happens in this, or rather how this is conducted, I guess I would say, is that there's a certain dialectic to history. This is the big $10 word for today's episode, dialectic. And what that, like dialogue between two people, two things. And Hegel thought that dialectic referred to, the way he meant it, and the way a lot of philosophers mean it, is that it refers to two things in opposition that kind of go back and forth. There's a dialectic between them. And so for Hegel, that was something like the forces of freedom and the forces of less freedom, oppression or tyranny or control or order or whatever. And so let's say order and freedom kind of have this dialectic. They go back and forth with each other. And as they go back and forth, they unfold over the course of history and lead to more and more freedom. So you might picture, like, if you personified freedom as a person and you personified non-freedom, whatever you want to call that, less freedom, oppression, or order, or rigidity, or whatever, as another person, like we need order, we need freedom. And then those two people were having an argument. And sometimes the non-freedom side would get the upper hand, and sometimes the freedom side would get the upper hand. But as they kept arguing over time, they would start to get closer and closer to agreeing on a more and more free conception of the world. And if you kind of picture it that way, then you get a sense of what Hegel means by the progression of freedom through history as a kind of dialogue between these two forces, freedom and non-freedom. Again, if you're a Hegel scholar and you have all these footnotes you want to add to it, I appreciate you. There's a lot more to it, but I'm oversimplifying this as a way to give us a backdrop for what's going on with Marxism. Why does all of this matter for Karl Marx? And the answer is that he was influenced by Hegel like so many Germans of his time, German philosophers and German intellectuals. And so we're going to now answer the question, what is Marx's underlying worldview? What is at the bottom of what he believes about the nature of the world? And it turns out he has a historiography. He has a philosophy of history. And he believes that history does have a dialectic to it, and that there is a progression through history, but it's not of some immaterial spirit. It's not of Geist, and it's not really of freedom exactly. It's the history of class struggle. So let me read you a quote from the Communist Manifesto, Chapter 1. He says, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open, fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes." Excuse me. So let's break this down a little bit. He says all of history can be reduced to class struggle, to class warfare. And he gives the names of different classes. And then he further reduces them and says, in a word, oppressor and oppressed. And this is his entire view of history. He thinks that the philosophy of history can be reduced to these two forces all throughout human history. And that they're always fighting. Sometimes it's hidden, sometimes it's open, and it either ends with revolution and transformation of society, or in common ruin. So everybody just ruins each other and the society breaks down. Now, the way that I think scholars have talked about this is with this word, or this phrase, dialectical materialism. So now we have the $20 word. So you could call Hegel's thing dialectical idealism, meaning he thought there was a dialogue in history between these two forces that was idealist in nature. It was about something higher than the material, the spirit, the Geist, freedom, some kind of abstract spiritual or symbolic forces. Marx says there is a dialectic to history, but it's materialist. It's a dialectical materialism. And that means, yes, there's a dialogue through history, but we can only really analyze it, or the highest way or the best way to analyze it is in terms of material. Oppressor and oppressed, class struggle. In other words, the haves and the have-nots. So his theory of history is entirely based on materialism. We're just struggling about who has what. And another way to put this is, if you believe that only the material exists, that there's no real spiritual world, or if there is, we can't really know anything about it, in other words, secularism, then all you're really left with as a primary reality, as your main experience of the world, is materialism, materiality. Who has what? Who has enough money? Who has more money? And therefore who has more power? Struggle, fighting, material, and therefore all of history can be reduced to economics. Who has what? So I'll give you another quote from Marx here. Oh, and by the way, he talks about these two, the current situation in his time. He talks about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And these are French words. And, if you were an intellectual at the time, it was considered fancy to use the French words for everything. Nietzsche does this. Everybody does it. I don't know why. I mean, I do, but it's France, is this intellectual giant. So we have to use French words to be cool. Okay. He just means the middle class and the working class. That's what bourgeois and proletariat means. So whenever you hear bourgeoisie, that's the adjective. He's talking about the middle class who owns property and the working class who doesn't. That's the proletariat. So he says, the bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian nations, into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. So there's a lot going on here. Obviously, there's historical, trade with China, blah, blah, blah. But what I want you to see here is that his conception of life is that industry is the most powerful thing. He talks about the cheap prices of commodities are this artillery to batter down the Chinese walls, quote unquote. He's using warfare terminology for economics. Because on pain of extinction, if you don't get part of the machine of production, if you don't, you got to join it or go extinct, basically, because prices are too cheap. The machines of the industry are too powerful. The commodities are so valuable. Like, economics can destroy even here, the example he gives is the Chinese hatred of the foreigner. You force them to open their borders because they can't stand up to industrialism. And what you have to, and yes, I mean, you could say, sure, this all happened historically, but what you have to appreciate about Marx's vision of this here is that material conditions are totalizing and irresistible. You cannot resist material conditions. You must capitulate. Now, this says a lot about what he thinks of the supremacy of material conditions, right? There's nothing in here about any other motives than economic motives and survival. And we're going to come back to that. So, but first, as I did last week with fascism, I want to give a little bit of a steelman about why might you find this perspective compelling before we talk about what's wrong with it. And, obviously industrialism was this kind of shocking horror. The emergence of industrialism in the mid-modernity period was just crazy. I mean, kids were working in sweatshops. Like you could see it as enslavement, industrial enslavement. It was quite horrible. And that's why there are all these incredibly strict British labor laws now. I actually heard that during the filming of the original Harry Potter movies, when the kids were all minors, the main characters, the actors and actresses, they actually took a really long time to film because British labor laws were so strict about children working that they couldn't just shoot all day long like you could with adult actors. The labor laws were so stringent that the kids could only be on set for a certain amount of hours per day. And it was extremely, frustrating to try to get these films shot in any amount of time. So in other words, Britain went to the opposite extreme because at this time they just had nothing resembling child labor laws. It was a huge mess. So I give you some Marx quotes. So he says here, masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. Notice the warfare imagery here remaining. As privates of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and of the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, the overlooker, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself, the guy who owns everything. The more openly this despotism proclaims gains to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. So, yeah, it was a very exploitative situation, and people were going to starve to death if they didn't, they're sending their children at 6 years old to go work in factories for pennies. I mean, this is a bad situation. Now, obviously, you want to criticize this. And he identifies this kind of situation as destroying basically everything that has any other kind of value. So I'll give you another quote here. He says, the bourgeois left no other nexus between man and woman than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned out the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. So, insofar as this happened at the time and continues to happen today, that's bad. But what is his solution? Because obviously Christianity is going to call out materialism and say this is no good, and it's ultimately it sort of kind of puts us in a similar situation to fascism from last episode, where if the material is all that exists, then we take this survival of the fittest approach, and then here's what here's what we're going to do, or here's the only thing that matters. Similar situation here, but what is his solution? What is the therefore? Because we can all accept this kind of diagnosis that this is bad. He says this, and he's talking to his sort of capitalist interlocutor or who, the critic, a lot of these kind of manifestos and diatribes from this era will address in second person the critic that they're kind of responding to. So he says, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is just what we intend. From the moment when labor can no longer be converted into capital, money, or rent, into a social power capable of being monopolized, i.e., from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property, into capital, from that moment, you say, individuality vanishes. You must, therefore, confess that by individual, you mean no other person than the bourgeois, than the middle-class owner of property. This person must, indeed, be swept out of the way and made impossible. So, in other words, he's responding to critics who said, look, if you take away private property, which is something he wanted to do, and everything is held in common, then people are not going to have individual autonomy over their stuff. I mean, this is basic to liberalism, right? We need government and laws and stuff to secure our enjoyment of our stuff. This is literally in Locke and Hooker. So if you get rid of that, then you get rid of individualism. So on liberalism, actually, this is a big problem. And so the liberal society at the time is criticizing this. And he doubles down on it. He just says, yes, we want to do away with individual property, but, and he contests the definitions like a good philosopher. Is he a good philosopher? I don't know. But that's a good philosophy move. He says, you have to get rid of this because individual just means individualism for the bourgeoisie. In other words, the wage slaves don't have individualism. They're just monopolized by the machine and completely exploited. So the only people who have individualism is the bourgeoisie. So yeah, let's get rid of that thing that you call individualism. Now, this is actually fallacious. This doesn't respond to the argument as such. It's actually entirely rhetorical. He's using a rhetorical device here, but that doesn't actually answer the question at the core philosophical level that the liberal is going to object to, which is that what is the basis of human freedom? Is it having control over your own stuff? And you see how he skirts around that issue. And then I'll give you another quote here. He says, communism deprives, this is what he's advocating for, communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriations. So again, I want to emphasize here that Marx's solution is to change the material conditions of society. He acknowledges that there's a problem, but because his philosophical commitment is that of materialism, and that material is either the only thing or the most important thing, then the only solution can be a material solution. That's the only thing that's possible. We have to remove the societal conditions, in other words, the material, physical ability for some people to exploit others in order to stop exploitation from happening. And while that may literally be a solution, what I want you to pay attention to is his assumptions, which is that man is by nature subject to material and social conditions. In other words, so society is what causes problems. Social conditions are what cause problems. The material situation is the primary reality, and that's what makes people free or unfree. In other words, we're totally dependent upon material conditions to be happy or good or free or even to be individuals. The material conditions are the most important thing, and society needs to be changed with this in mind. That is a very big difference, right? A lot of people think that Marxism is about critiques of what they vaguely call capitalism or various modern forms of industrialism. It's in fact a very specific critique from a very specific direction, which is materialism and the idea that the material conditions are the most important factors in your life. Now, obviously, liberalism will agree with this, but ultimately disagree with him because you need control over your material conditions, not to get rid of private property. And fascism, of course, thinks that this is craziness. We saw that last week, because obviously there's other motives you can have in life than economic motivations. We're going to come back to that. But it is time for a break. So we're going to go to break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about, therefore, Marx's view of ideas and religion and spirituality on this kind of materialistic paradigm. And then we're going to do some assessment of these core ideas. And I will see you in just a minute. How do you explain the sacraments? It's easy to say they're mysteries that we have to take on faith or on the authority of tradition, but that is not how the early Christians understood them. To them, and to all ancient people, the idea that physical objects had spiritual power was very intuitive, whereas modern people tend to find this difficult, bizarre, or even unchristian. This is because we live in an era shaped by secularism, a way of viewing the world that's incompatible with sacramental thinking. Because secular ideas are at the heart of our culture, modern people tend to think in secular ways without realizing it, even the most well-meaning of us. How then do we live in, but not be of, a secular culture? We need to understand the enchanted, sacramental way that the early Christians viewed the world, but we also need to understand secularism. What is it really? Where did it come from? And how does it influence how we think about religion? Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age breaks down these important issues in accessible, non-academic language and is an ideal introduction for young readers, catechumens, and seekers, as well as for any Orthodox Christians who want to deepen their understanding of the sacraments.
Journey to Reality, Sacramental Life in a Secular Age by Zachary Porcu. Now available at store.ancientfaith.com. Again, that is store.ancientfaith.com.
Welcome back. I'm seeing a lot of comments here about where Marx is relative to do ideas drive history, all this kind of stuff. Great. We were going to talk about that next. So let's get some quotes, because you know me, we got to have the primary sources. I would rather talk from primary sources other than just kind of making up stuff. So let's see what he says about the other things, the other forces in the world besides material conditions. What does he say? Here's a short one. He says, law, morality, religion are to him so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. He's talking about him. He means the worker, the proletariat. Law, morality, religion are to the working class bourgeois prejudices that behind which lurk in ambush, so sinister, bourgeois interests. In other words, these things, these ideas are just means of solidifying bourgeois interests into the popular imagination. Let's jump. So how does this play out? Let's jump to the next quote. The charge against communism made from a religious, philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. Okay, well, let's see. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conception, in one word, man's consciousness, changes with every change in the conditions of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life? What else does the history of ideas prove than that intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed? The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. So here it is, ladies and gentlemen, that ideological, philosophical, religious things, these are just means for the ruling class to control the working class. And the reason that sort of evidence that he gives for this is that ideas in a given age change according to the material conditions of that age. And I think this is you can say, yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Like there's a baseline where this is compelling. Because you can see that, yes, it's the case that ruling ideologies are often, well, it's often the case that the ruling class uses certain ideologies and messaging to control the lower classes. That does happen. True. But is that sufficient to therefore claim that those things aren't real or that they have no reality in history? That's a jump. So you have to notice what Marx does all the time. He takes these things that are easy to agree with and then extrapolates from them to massive conclusions about the nature of reality and about the nature of history. He just, in one paragraph, wiped out the primary or even secondary value of beliefs about spiritual, philosophical, and religious matters as having any real driving force in history. And he's reduced everything to material conditions. That's not the same thing as admitting that, yes, it is the case that from time to time, or even frequently, that ideas are weaponized by certain people in the ruling class. But you see how that's not the same claim as saying that all of history can ignore all of those factors to the human existence. And he's coming off of the medieval to modern era. And so if you look back at the history of modernity, the 30 Years' War, all the Catholic and Protestant violence at the beginning of modernity, yeah, it makes sense that you would think, oh, okay, I'm just going to be super cynical now because religion was just this tool for us to murder each other and enforce state absolutism. That was true at that period in history. But if you take this lens and you try to examine any ancient society, it's gonna not work. It's just not going to work. Now, they try to do this. Marxist scholars will therefore go into every single other period of history, every single culture, and they'll try to reduce everything to a class struggle. And you can sort of whip up that narrative. It's possible to do that, and there's an infinite amount of peer-reviewed papers that no one reads that try to argue that this is how you have to read history. But when you read the primary sources, it just doesn't make sense. And here's how you know that. You can imagine motives that are higher than economic motives. And people do things that are higher than mere survival and economics all of the time. People will sacrifice their material prosperity for ideals that they believe are higher than the material. The fact that people have done that all throughout human history, and that those people have become the focal points of gigantic religious movements and spiritual movements at every point in history, is a very clear historical counterexample that's very strong to this idea that it's just material conditions are the most primary thing. Think about all of the monks in poverty, or look at the Buddhist monks, for goodness sake. I mean, if you know anything about, I'd love to do a series on Buddhism, by the way, and Hinduism. If you're interested, let me know. Siddhartha, famously was this prince, and he gave up all his material wealth and went into poverty after he had his spiritual vision and became the Buddha, one of the founders of the great world religions, and abandoned all his materiality because he realized that there's a higher life than the material world. So again, I'm sort of belaboring this because I think when you talk about Marxism, it's so easy to get drawn into Karl Marx's fallacies, of which there are many. Like, this thing is bad, therefore all of history is this way. It's this bizarre, there's a name for this in philosophy, but this kind of argument. But basically, you take an example and you generalize it to this massive generalization. It's like the particular does not prove the general in this way, in this absolute way that he wants it to do. Let's get his full thoughts on this with a couple more quotes. Undoubtedly, it will be said, Religious, moral, philosophical, and juridical ideas have been modified in the course of historical development, but religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survive this change. He's giving, the context for this is he's giving his actually, did I put this in here? No, let's keep going. So then he says, there are besides eternal truths such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society. But communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality instead of constituting them on a new basis. It therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experiences. Sorry, what I was going to say is that these two quotes are him talking about, he's putting words in the mouth of his critic. So he's saying, my critics will say the following. They'll say, yes, they'll admit that religious ideas have been modified through history, but they survive that modification. They survive that abuse by the ruling class, and that there are eternal truths, freedom and justice, that are common to everyone. That's what Cicero said when we looked at this a few weeks ago. And the critic is saying that communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes religion and all morality. And it acts in contradiction to all past historical experience. So how does he... So this is what his concern that the critic is saying to him, which is, basically what we're kind of saying. So what's his argument against this criticism? This is very interesting. Watch this. He says, what does this accusation reduce itself to? The history of all past society has consisted in the development of class antagonisms that assumed different forms at different epochs. But whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common to all past ages, viz., means, in other words, the exploitation of one part of society by the other. No wonder, then, that the social consciousness of past ages, despite all the multiplicity and variety it displays, moves within certain common forms or general ideas which cannot completely vanish except with the total disappearance of class antagonisms. The communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. No wonder that its development involved the most radical rupture with traditional ideas. Let me explain this. So, the critic says, look, communism is, there are truth, justice, freedom, there are these ideal things that exist. All societies have always believed in them, and communism is trying to abolish them. And he basically says, yes. And why does he say that? He says, look, he doubles down on his premise. The history of all past society has consisted in the development of class antagonisms. And because all previous history is class antagonism, no wonder there is a common set of moral values that all societies have adhered to up to this point. So, in other words, he takes the claim that, well, look, there are these eternal truths that every society has always believed in. And he says, yes, because every society is based on class antagonisms. So those eternal truths aren't really eternal truths. They're just the tools of the ruling class. And so the reason we've never seen something other than these ideas, and the reason that they look like they're universal truths, are because they came out of all the class antagonism of all of human history. And so therefore, yes, the communist revolution wants to do away with all of those so-called eternal truths and moral values because it's getting rid of class antagonism. So naturally, and this is the first time anyone's tried to get rid of the class antagonism, so naturally we're going to see new values as a result. Now, you see that this is actually incredibly circular. So he says, look, all of history is reducible to class antagonisms. Therefore, all of these ideals, freedom, beauty, truth, goodness, whatever, those were just the weaponized tools of the ruling class to control the working class. And then when the critic says, but those things really exist, and we know that because everybody, you see it everywhere. His response is, no, they don't. Because, as we know, all history is the history of class warfare. So he just doubles down on his premise This is just an assumption that he believes. Because why? What's underneath it? Materialism. So in other words, his belief in materialism, that the material conditions of life are the most important / only important things, he doesn't actually address the criticism. He just says, no, those things aren't real. So yeah, of course, it looks to you like the communist is trying to abolish morality, but morality's fake. It's just a tool of the ruling class. Now, I don't know about you, but you need to do a lot more to prove that morality is fake. I mean, he's not saying that exactly, but that's really what's going on between the lines here. It's actually an incredible, bold thing that he's just kind of assuming implicitly into his argument. And like I said, you need to do a lot more to prove that the history of all previous, because the implication is the history of all previous belief systems that ever appealed to something like universal good, universal freedom or value or dignity or spirituality or morality, whatever, those are reducible to class warfare. They're just the tools of the ruling class. That's a mega crazy giant claim. And basically no proof is offered of that other than to gesture at, yes, sometimes that does happen. But there's missing premises, as we say in philosophy, from sometimes this happens to that's not real. You know, that would be like saying, well, people cheat on their spouses a lot or some amount. Therefore, all marriage is fake. And I understand that some people who are cynical may find that emotionally appealing, but logically it's not. It doesn't make sense. Because all you have to do is show one marriage that works, and then you're like, oh, well, then we can't say all marriage is fake. It's clearly real, even if it's broken. You see what I'm saying? Class relations are broken in all kinds of periods of history. There is exploitation. That's just a fact. But does that mean that society itself is invalidated or that morality itself is invalidated? That's an insane claim, actually. So I want you to get a sense of these sort of fallacious moves that he's making. So this informs my viewing of all of these kind of internet arguments about Marxism, where people want to talk about, well, you know, is it true that there's exploitation and corporate abuse and all these kinds of things? Of course that's true. I don't know how you would deny that. But why is that the case? And what, therefore, is the solution? And the Marxists claim that that's the case because the material is the only thing that exists, and the solution is to, therefore, remove all the material conditions for exploitation. Those are claims that are very, very big, and if I may, I think above his pay grade here. He really is not providing a argument for these philosophical assumptions that he brings in to the discussion. In other words, Marxism is not merely the observation that certain types of economic arrangements have been exploitive and that we need to find new ones. If that's all Marxism was, I think everyone would just agree with that. But you don't need a new philosophy to notice that abuses happen and that some economic systems incentivize or don't disincentivize that kind of abuse. I mean, all of these things can be improved, obviously. That's not what Marx is claiming. Marx is claiming that all of history is reducible to a materialist dialectic, that material conditions are the only things that matter. And this is the heart of his whole philosophy of history. And so you see this assumption play out in basically everything that historically has been inspired by Marx's ideas. Let's take Hitler's Nazi Party, the National Socialist movement. Last week, we got a lot of quotes from Hitler about survival of the fittest. And that type of language, I said, where does this type of language make sense? It makes a lot of sense on atheist materialism. In other words, on a material assumption of the nature of reality. Okay, so eugenics makes sense on this materialist assumption. What else makes sense? Soviet atheism. Soviet Union is famously the first nation in the world to declare itself an atheist institution. Why are they doing that? Because they're materialists, because they're inspired by Marx's materialism. And then, of course, just like Hitler, Stalin, millions and millions of people killed and murdered, of their own people too. Stalin worse, actually, if you're just doing it by body count, higher than Hitler. Something people don't talk about. Okay, so now you got two things that were inspired by Marx that lead to like infinite bloodshed and murder. And people will say, okay, well, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about communism. We're talking about stuff like, socialist, liberal kind of fusion ideas like the Norwegian countries or something, the Scandinavian countries. And Marxism is there too in a different form. So the socialist liberal type of person has this idea as this basic assumption that society's problems, that people's problems are caused by society. Not that there's some kind of problem with human nature. Not that there's sin or that we're fallen or that we need to be saints or that the big problem with humanity is that we lack virtue or anything like that. The assumption is you'd be fine if your material conditions were different. You would be okay. You would be a good person, in fact. If you didn't have to worry about paying the bills, you would be a good person. Your vices are just a result of your material lack of prosperity. This is the Star Trek dream, right? Like, oh, well, we're post-scarcity society. So now that we're post-scarcity, now everybody just pursues their own good and people just work for the benefit of themselves and others. That's assuming that vision of the world is assuming that it's society that causes your problems. Now, why would you, irrespective of, and actually in opposition to any other theory of the problem of existence, no sin, no vice, like these are not really the problems. Okay, that's a radical belief about the nature of the world that Christians and pagans don't really sign off on. Only modern materialist people do this, right? So, in other words, in Hitler's National Socialism, we see the influence of Marx's materialism, his dialectical materialism. In Soviet atheism, we see the influence of Marx's dialectical materialism. In like a nice, peaceful Scandinavian country's assumption that societal, or I don't even know, I'm not going to pick on the Scandinavian countries. I'm going to pick on people who sort of idealize those models. Yes, society would be better if we just fixed the engineering problems. We turn all these dials and then people are going to stop having problems all of a sudden. That's also assuming materialism. You see, that all of these things are very different, obviously. But again, this is the roots of everything. We go down and we pull up the roots. Like the fruit is all different, but the root is the same. That's my argument. The root is that all of history can be reduced to materialist struggle. Okay, so does that make sense? Can we do that? And again, I was getting at this earlier, I think you just know that this is false if you are not a strict doctrinaire materialist, which very few people are these days. I know a lot of people say they are, but very, very few people are. So can you imagine doing something that is not in your economic best interest, but is for another reason that you consider higher than economics? I think you can. People do things for love. People do things for relationships. People do things for moral reasons. People lose money or give away their money in order to do what they perceive to be good in the world. People sacrifice their economic prosperity and advantages all the time for causes that they believe to be higher than the self. So I guess people can have motivations that are not reducible to economics. That's very interesting. I wonder, can we think of examples of anyone in history who was willing to be tortured and killed for something higher than the self? Who believed that there was some spiritual or moral reality more important to hold to than material prosperity or comfort? I wonder if we could find any examples of that in history. Because, of course, the religious idea is that the material world is not the ultimate reality, that we're on this journey to reality. that there are things like glory and beauty and goodness and truth and honor that command your attention and your material sacrifice. Every pagan civilization sacrificed material things. First fruits offering. Israel did it. Pagans did it. Sacrifice animals, their livestock, the food that they need to eat. They sacrifice them, literally pour them out and burn up portions of them to the gods, because the gods, or the God of gods, commanded their attention and their loyalty and their reverence. And this had nothing to do with material prosperity. I mean, obviously, a lot of pagan groups believe that if we do this stuff, then that will ensure our material prosperity and all these kinds of things. But then you're getting into a society that views the spiritual and the physical as interrelated. And we've talked a lot about that. So, in other words, I'm being a little sarcastic here, just a little. But Marxism is a utopian vision. Just like liberalism, just like fascism, these ideologies of the 20th century are ultimately worldly and utopian because they're materialistic in some sense. Marx is actually right here being materialistic and what we call reductionist in philosophy. That means you reduce something down to its most basic levels, and it kind of is a loss to do so, right? Like if I said, love is just a chemical reaction. Well, there is a chemical component to love, but by saying it's just a chemical reaction, you're being reductive. You're saying all the other things that are involved in love, and then especially in our experience of love, are illusory or secondary to the point that they really don't matter and they kind of aren't valid. As the highest level of this reality is the chemical reaction. And that's what we call being reductive, because it obviously doesn't explain all of the reality or the experience of love. It's the same thing that happens when you reduce all of society to materialist conditions. So Marx does that. Fascism's funny because a lot of fascist rhetoric talks about spirituality, and it talks about, Mussolini is very nostalgic about Rome, and Hitler, uses a lot of religious kind of imagery in Mein Kampf. Actually, when I was kind of reading through Mein Kampf, I noticed all the points where he kind of makes these religious language parallels. So that's really, and then of course Franco, he's trying to do a Catholic kind of fascist thing. Again, we didn't get into Franco, but maybe we'll come back to it. They use this religious language, Hitler and Mussolini, but they are not, like, ultimately I think materialism is hidden in there with this absolute emphasis on survival of the fittest and total absolute statism in Mussolini. And those things just kind of assume materialism, ultimately, regardless of the religious language that they're using. And then liberalism says, okay, we're going to guarantee everybody's freedom and equality and all that stuff, and we're going to kind of soft input all of these Christian values into our liberal system, but we're going to adopt this official agnosticism about these spiritual things. And we're not going to say one way or the other. And the problem is that sort of agnosticism or refusal to choose a value system, in theory, that sounds good because then everybody can just do what they want. But that means that the society itself is going to be functionally materialist. Do you see how that is a problem? Like if we say, no, we're not going to comment on this at all, well, then it may as well not exist. We're not going to incorporate it into our society. We're not going to comment on it. It's not going to be a valid part of our common discourse. It's like, okay, well, then our society isn't run by those ideas. And in fact, our society ignores those ideas. So our society is functionally materialist as well. So what's going on in comments? Comment in the live chat, rather. Many discussions about Marx, as so frequently happens. I think that Marx is just something that it's easy to get. It's easy to extrapolate these modern nation state concerns into worldviews. So like you want to be free and have material prosperity. Therefore, liberalism is the correct, true way to view the world. That's too big of a jump. You might say maybe you find it appealing to like some of this fascist language about, glory and development of the species and superior, creations of beauty and works of culture and all that stuff. Therefore, the state is everything and survival of the fittest is the ultimate law. Too big of a jump. Modern industrialism exploits people and is horrible at its worst and constantly needs to be kept in check at best. True. Therefore, all of history and all non-material motives are reducible to materiality. Way too big of a jump. You see what I mean? This is part of the problem with all of these worldviews, all of these types of running government. They're all coming out of what? They're all coming out of modernity. And if you listen to the previous series, you'll see that with modernity, with the Enlightenment, with the new kind of era of Western civilization, you get a materialist view of the world that's, hidden or explicit or however you want to put it. None of these nation-state models really are able to validate a higher spiritual, even moral vision for reality. Even fascism, who tries, it dresses it all up. But none of them do it. None of them succeed, really. And you know that. You know that already. I mean, liberalism and communism got together, they beat fascism. And then liberalism and communism fought for a while. That was the Cold War. And then when the Soviet Union fell and then China kind of became more capitalist or whatever, then liberalism succeeded. So, and in the end of the 90s, people were like, that's it. Fascism lost first. Then there was a long struggle. Then communism was defeated. And now the liberal democracy is king. And people were so triumphalist about this. Francis Fukuyama, the famous Japanese economist, he said, this is the end of history. And what he meant was not like the world was going to end. He meant that the whole struggle of history, in other words, the historical progression, was a struggle to get to this point where the liberal democracy validated itself as the correct, true way to run society, and that there would now be no more historical struggle about how to run society. Now, obviously, that's not true because we are having all of these international political problems, as usual, and people at home are not happier. Again, I pointed this out. A lot of experts are saying that we are in a mental health epidemic. Material prosperity has gone up. Technological power has gone up. You are listening to me. I'm in Southern California. I don't know where you are, but you're not in my room. How are we doing this? It's incredible. People are more miserable and depressed and anxious than they've ever been in this country. So these modes are not working. They're just not working. And I want to suggest that the reason for that is that the roots are bad. The roots are materialist. And materialism doesn't work. In the sense that it does not explain, it doesn't adequately model the human experience. Because you know that there are things higher than material conditions. And you know that there are things you would do that are higher than material. And the greatest people in human history did things regardless of whether they would survive or not. People died for glory and honor and for family and for religion. This happened all the time, and it still happens. So anyway, now, okay, so I've been very thorough in saying that all of these three types of government have bad roots. And of course, everyone asks, okay, what do we do? How then should we run society? Or more specifically, perhaps as Orthodox Christians or as this type of person, how do we then try to interact with the fact that we live in these kinds of liberal democracies or various Marxist influences or whatever? What do we do? Do we try to fix one of these three? Do we try to revive one of the dead ones? Do we try to go back? Well, no, I'm a monarchist. Or let's go back to the Byzantine Empire or whatever. And I've also said that on this show that I don't think nostalgia is correct. I don't think nostalgia, you can't go back. You just really can't. I mean, literally. You have to go forward. And here's a word for the Christians out there. The eschaton, meaning the kingdom of heaven, is not at a prior point in history. It's at a future point in history. So if you want to go back, whatever you want to go back to, you're going in the opposite direction of the kingdom of heaven. Maybe put it that way. So next week, we're going to talk about this exact topic. What then do I think is the ideal form of government? Or how then shall we interact with these governments? How then shall we live? This is always the most important question, right? Well, we're going to have a whole episode on it next week. Same time, 1 p.m. live on my Substack. So if you remember the Roots of Everything, the official YouTube page here, we do 4 weeks on, 2 weeks off. 4 weeks on, 2 weeks off for a whole series. So the first 4 episodes of the series are here on YouTube, live. Welcome, hello. And then in the gap, the 2-week gap between series, there are the bonus episodes on my Substack. We are doing a launch special, by the way, until Pentecost. It's like 58% off or something like that if you subscribe before Pentecost. So more on this next week. I'm really looking forward to this. So many questions have been coming in on YouTube and on Substack about how then shall we live? So no episode live here for the next 2 weeks, but it will be live. We'll still be here. It'll be live on my Substack. So, and I think we're going to post something on the main channel here the day after or something like that. Alrighty then. I think that's it. I think we got there. There's so much going on in comments that I am not sure where I see a lot of interesting discussion here. I'm going to read through this after we're done. Yes. Lots of really interesting. Okay, I'm looking forward to reading this. And I'm going to incorporate some of what you guys are saying here into next week for sure, because everyone has so much agitation about these things. I see somebody visited St. Andrew, my home parish. Hello, welcome. Hit me up if you see me there. Matt says, recently found your channel. God bless you. Thank you. Christ is risen. I will see you guys next week. I'm really looking forward to it, and I hope that we can arrive at something that is not depressing and sad. Here's one. What are your thoughts on Jonathan Pageau's latest video on the World War II narrative is ending? I just saw that this video came up. I haven't seen it yet, so I'm gonna check it out. I think it might be cool if I respond to it on my Substack on Wednesday. So I do a Wednesday post every week. That might be a cool Wednesday reflection because it's on this topic actually, and it's relevant to how the narrative in the liberal democracy that we're in now is starting to break down. Is for the better, for the worse, we'll see. We'll see. Okay. I think that's it. We're a little over time anyway. Thank you guys for joining me live. Always such a pleasure to see all the interaction. And I will see you either Wednesday or next week at 1 p.m. live on Substack. Thank you guys for joining me. This has been a listener and viewer supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio, and I will see you on the other side.